Hello, YouTube. I am joining you guys from beautiful and sunny Medellin, Colombia. And the reason for today's video is the subject's been on my mind a fair amount recently because I've spent in the last few years a fair amount of time in the US and then a fair amount of time abroad, most recently here in Colombia. And I'm trying to share some observations with you all that might be considering working abroad, working remotely for, say, an American company, but living in, say, Mexico or Colombia or Thailand, wherever you might want to go, that you can, of course, follow the proper permitting and work visa situation. But arriving on the question that's been on my mind, the question is, what makes this kind of scenario play out? And the scenario I'm observing is that goods tend to be more expensive, whether they're domestically produced or imported. They tend to be more expensive relative to local incomes, whereas services tend to be cheaper. This is, in the case I'm speaking, developing countries versus developed countries. When I think of developed countries, I think of countries like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom. When I think of developing countries, I think of most countries that aren't those countries. And I've noticed a dynamic where it seems like in the predominantly English-speaking world, that your goods tend to be cheaper and your services tend to be more expensive, especially in the United States. I can't speak as much on the other countries, but I'm from the United States, so much of my experience prior to international travel was in the United States. And I noticed, like I said, goods tend to be cheaper and services tend to be more expensive. Well, in the developing world, it seems like it's the opposite. It seems like goods tend to be more expensive and services tend to be cheaper. And in this video, I want to discuss what makes goods more expensive than in the United States. What makes things cost more money in, say, the Philippines or Cambodia or Colombia. And these are theories. I'm not like an economist. I'm not a trained financial pro. This isn't financial advice. And I'm just kind of speculating on what factors I think might be at play when it comes to what makes goods, broadly speaking, more expensive. And what do I mean by goods? Well, what I mean by goods is the things that you need in your day-to-day life, such as that aren't necessarily always requisites for survival. So you don't need a laptop to survive, but it's going to be really, really difficult to travel without one. You don't necessarily need a cell phone to survive. I know that's arguable, and I'm not trying to split hairs here, but some of these things, like, you can technically functionally breathe, eat, and sleep, etc. without one, but it's going to be a whole lot more difficult to operate without one. So once again, when I'm speaking about goods, I'm talking about day-to-day items that are really needed that you can't necessarily create out of thin air or walk to the store next door and immediately get it. And so when I think about things like notebooks, like recently I've had to purchase a notebook here in Colombia. When I think about camera gear, I'm looking at having to get a little bit of camera gear. I'm going to be paying more for these items here in Colombia than I would in the United States. And it had me thinking, like, what's the reason for that? And I've had similar experiences in Thailand. I remember purchasing a calculator that would have been like maybe $10, $15 in the US. I spent about $40, the equivalent of about $40 in Thailand. It had me thinking, what's causing this? So I've got a number of factors here that I'm going to discuss. And the first and most obvious one here in Latin America anyways is security. And in many cases, the Latin American governments may have some financial challenges, or it may just not be a priority to heavily fund police forces, at least on a local level. So in many cases where they need to make up for this, a lot of businesses hire private security. So you'll notice many of the higher end districts, the nicer parts of town, even the residential areas for wealthy locals, a lot of these places are going to have private security people. And these people are not working for the government, but they are working for private individuals and businesses to help make sure a given business is safe, it's protected from perhaps robbery or theft or assailants, etc. And that's a cost. That comes at a cost. You're not just paying for the security professionals' time, but you're also paying for, let's say they drive an armored vehicle. Let's say they have to wear special gear that's kind of protective of them. These kinds of things do cost extra money, and even though you don't necessarily see the money changing hands at the business, when you go to purchase something, that's something that is going to be built into the cost. And in the United States, where I'm from anyway, typically grocery stores do not have security. I'm not using this to talk down about a given country, but it is what it is. It's part of doing business. And if you're traveling, especially long term, you're going to have to understand the business dynamics of any given country you're in if you want to make financially prudent decisions. So aside from the aspect of security that you're paying for, you're also paying for the safe storage and transportation of cash. And that's not necessarily a criticism, like I said, of crime statistic or anything like that in a given country, but it's just that a lot of countries aren't as card oriented as the United States. They're not as e-payment oriented as China. And so in many cases, there's a lot of cash, and the cash has to be transported safely. It needs to be able to be delivered to banks. It needs to be able to transport it to ATMs. Businesses need to be able to account for all of that. And so you have businesses that have to build that into their cost of doing business. And I understand that they'd probably have cost as well if they were predominantly taking credit cards like many American businesses, but it's still worth considering. Next, typically, we talk about security. Insurance is another cost that can go up in certain areas that may have security challenges. If you're doing business in an area or a city, a country with higher crime statistics, more security issues, robberies, these types of things, your insurance premium and your insurance bill is going to be higher as a result. You're going to have to pay for that. So customers do have to pay for that. When you do purchase goods at a certain store, and you might wonder, why is the price high seemingly arbitrarily? These security features are part of that bill. The insurance factor, the fact that they're paying perhaps a higher insurance bill relative to local incomes than you'd be paying in the United States, than they'd be paying if they're doing business in the United States. These types of things and costs have to basically come over to consumers. And following up on that, several more additional reasons I think that contribute to goods being more expensive in some of these countries is you're doing business with a lot of businesses that have less competition from online shopping. I would never say no competition from online shopping. Certainly e-commerce is growing around the world. People love the convenience. I worked in e-commerce for a while. I get the dynamic. I understand that retail is definitely at least in-person retail is really hurting in the United States. But part of that is because the United States, at least from what I've gathered, I've also worked in a retail environment, that these retail corporations tend to understaff their stores. You tend to have a difficult time finding an employee. And when you do find an employee, unless you're at a few specialized stores, perhaps like an auto parts store, the employee is unlikely to know anything about the given topic. And this happens really frequently at certain businesses, retail businesses more than others. I'm not going to name any. I don't want to make any enemies, but certainly you've had experience if you're an American in a retail environment where you're working with an employee that doesn't know anything about what you're talking about. And so I've noticed sort of opposite that in many developing countries that the retail environment is heavily staffed. You go into a store and there's plenty of employees. You can get individualized attention in many cases very, very quickly. It's rare that I am not attended to immediately in a developing country when I walk into a nice retail store. If I'm not attended to immediately, it's usually because they're really, really busy and I'm like next in line. But I feel like 9 times out of 10, whether it's been in Thailand, Philippines, here in Colombia, all of the developing countries, I should say, I misspoke there. All the developing countries I've been to, they really seem to emphasize good service. They want to take good care of their customers, and that comes at a cost. And so you might think, oh, well, they're paying their employees, 15 or 20% of what they'd pay someone to do the job in America. But they're hiring more people as a result, and so things get done more efficiently. It's a more pleasant environment. Employees aren't stressed out because they're expected to do more than what is reasonably possible. Um, there seems to be more of a community oriented feeling as opposed to competitive oriented feeling, like in the American retail environment. And these things do add up, and you do end up paying a premium for that. I personally enjoy some of these experiences. I've had some really, really nice retail experiences in developing countries in the last several years, and it's been like, wow, I can't always necessarily afford to buy everything this way, but when I can, it is so, so cool. You get this individualized attention, like you're not just like another like number to them, that they're actually really excited to be helping you, and they really want you to be happy with what you're buying, and they know that you're going to enjoy it. And I can talk a lot about these experiences, but they come at a cost. And so you might think that uh, things seem more expensive than what you'd think when it compares to local wages, but in many cases, people are paying for that really good quality service. And likewise, you've got a lot of people that aren't necessarily super savvy with shopping online. And in certain countries, they may have concerns that theft is an issue, that their package isn't going to be delivered uh, as expected. And so they do like to be able to go to a physical retail location and put their hands on the item and see the item and know that they're taking it home with them directly. And they're not trusting a courier service or a shipping service that may or may not be super reliable. And so the businesses do know, like, hey, we're going to get general support from the community as far as retail goes. So we need to charge, or we can get away with charging accordingly. So another thing that you may not have considered when it comes to cost of doing business in developing countries, infrastructure. In the United States, there's a big variety of infrastructure. We have rail transportation, we have semi trucks, we have cars, we have boats in some cases, depending on your location. There's a big variety. And because it's one landmass, except for Hawaii and Alaska, it's relatively easy to get goods back and forth across the country to different parts of the country and spread the costs around. And because of the population, it it's doable. But when you're in other countries that don't have the same infrastructure, perhaps they have mountainous terrain that they have to navigate, perhaps it's a series of islands that they're having to use boats on. When you have to transport things from boat to ship to airplane to truck to car, etc., this adds into the cost. So when you're purchasing something, I noticed when I was in the Philippines, I had to pay comparable prices for certain goods that I would pay in America, even if some of those goods were produced in the Philippines by local distributors. And that's because they have to pay a premium for the oil for the vehicles. Like they're paying, 4 or 5. Uh, if you're from the Philippines, I shouldn't say so much, but you're aware that they're paying $4 or $5, $6 a gallon when you convert $1.50 a liter or so. And so that cost goes into the goods. And that's where you're thinking, wow, the average person here makes a lot less money than an American person, but they're still going to pay $1 for a Coca-Cola or $1.50 for a Coca-Cola. And some of those unseen costs that you may not consider as a traveler are factored in. So even countries where there is this low sort of average income level and it seems like people are struggling, it's not necessarily going to be cheap. And I think that's a big misconception that some people have that I kind of want to break, is that certain countries are cheap to travel in. They're cheaper. They're cheaper in some ways than the United States, but if you're interested in working somewhere long term and you want these Western conveniences that I like, and I'm sure many of you like, I just want you to be prepared for those, the cost of those, and the hoops that you might have to jump through to get some of these things. It's not necessarily always going to be as easy as clicking a one click on Amazon and getting at your house a couple of days later. You might have to track down a couple of different stores in the city, and you might have to pay more than what you're expecting to pay. So, running on to my final several reasons that I want to share with everyone when it comes to why goods may cost more in a certain country. Hiring. We have a really big pool of talent in the United States, 350 million people and counting. And that means that people, because some people are willing to move across the country for a job, it can be really easy. I'm not going to say really easy, but it can be easier probably than some other countries to find talented, hardworking people simply because of the colleges. If nothing else, we've got tons of colleges in America putting out tons of qualified graduates every year. And these young people are savvy and they're sharp and they've really worked hard, and they're not better than anyone else, but it's worth saying that they're met halfway by employers looking for a lot of skilled and talented people. Anyway, what I'm getting at is that if you're in other countries, you may have a smaller country that's not as friendly to foreign workers. So because the pool of talent is smaller, because the applicant pool is smaller, even though they may pay much less than your home country, they may pay more than what the average local makes to attempt to retain that talent, to attempt to keep those good people at the business and doing a good job and taking care of customers, helping them make good money, cooking the food properly, doing a really good job with various services that they're looking to provide. And so that's worth considering, is that even if you think, oh, the average local only makes X amount, if you're encountering a quality service, understand that they may have higher costs than what the average would be. So moving on to the next topic, there's a lot of people in the developing world, developing kind of areas of our world that are entering the middle class. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I'd say if you ask me kind of the couple of reasons that are most important off the top of my head, first, multi-generational housing. It's really common from what I found in developing countries for people to live with their families, especially until like they get married. And so in this instance, me and many of my American friends, we've spent a third to half of our income at various given points just on a apartment. And I moved out when I was 18 years old. So I've been paying for rent for 10 years now as a late 20s guy. But in developing countries, it's much more common for people to live with their families. So even though they don't make a ton of money, or even if it doesn't seem like they make a lot of money, they're not spending all this money on rent and a car. And so they have money for other things like a really nice ice cream or a pizza. You'd be really surprised how popular Domino's is around the world, and it's always expensive relative to local incomes, in my opinion, for what you get. I like Domino's pizza, but it's not. It's considered a luxury in my mind. Having a freshly baked, piping hot pizza with a snap of a finger, that's a luxury, and it's really popular abroad. I'm really surprised how often I see Domino's and they're doing tons of business. I'm like, how do people afford this? But it's because there's a number of people that they live with family. So the money that they're not spending on high-end rent or a big car payment, they put toward little luxuries like that. And so that means that there's a bigger target audience or bigger demographic that can afford these types of products when you are traveling in developing countries. It's interesting to me because if I see comparable businesses and like the same kind of business in a developed versus developing country, it's much more often that I see the business in the developing country doing a lot more business and serving a lot more people and just being a lot busier. And it reminds me of America. I don't know, before social media became as prevalent, before cell phones became as prevalent to some extent. Those things are still prevalent here, but it's just a different feeling. And you see people like improving their lives and like keeping money within their family. Perhaps they go in with relatives on a business idea. I don't see that as much in the United States. Perhaps they they're sharing a car with a sibling, so they're not having to come off so much money when it comes to a monthly car payment. These kinds of things make it really interesting. Like, they contribute to the vibrancy. They contribute to the vibrancy. They do increase the cost when you do have more people looking to purchase a given thing. And to me, it's not the end of the world. I don't mind. I feel that because these things are still more affordable than where I am in the West, or where I've lived in the West, that it's not really, I'm not complaining about these things, but I do think it's important to be aware of these costs and be able to account to pay for these things. When you go for some ice cream here in Medellin, for example, you're not going to spend 10 cents on ice cream. It's still going to be a couple of bucks, maybe $3 or $4 if you're getting a more luxurious ice cream with more toppings and these types of things. Really delicious, really worth it. You should definitely try the gelato when you're here, but understand that some of these goods that you are buying, even ice cream as a good, it can cost more than what you might be expecting to pay. Finally, and I'm not going to get too much into this one. This is kind of my last one I'm going to touch on as far as what can cause goods to be more expensive in developing countries versus developed countries, and that's corruption. I'm not going to pick on a certain country or describe anything I've observed or witnessed. You can definitely do your own research and come to your own conclusions. I'm not here to point fingers. Personally, I think it's just part of humanity, society, and you have to kind of learn to accept it if you are going to travel the world and see the world and understand it in a different way than you can from the internet or videos or reading. I think it's disappointing, but there are a lot of things that can be disappointing. I just feel really fortunate to be able to travel. And thank you all so much for joining me in today's video. I hope today's video has been informative. I've talked about some of the things that I think can make traveling in the developed world more expensive when it comes to purchasing goods, whether it be your telephone, your laptop, your food, if you like Western products. These types of things can be more costly, and there are some reasons why, and don't necessarily always feel like it's arbitrarily you're getting the tourist price. In some cases, the infrastructure comes into play. In some other cases, it's the tax structure. In more other cases, it could be corruption, or it could be demand. There's a lot of different reasons why things cost the way they do. And I really hope you enjoy this video, and definitely give me a thumbs up if you want more content like this. Subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more videos. I hope this video has been informative, and thank you for watching.